Climatology in India, and did his master's and PhD at the University of Texas, Austin. After his PhD, he did a postdoc at the University of Texas Institute of Geophysics, was now wrapping up his second postdoc at Brown University, and will be joining the faculty as an assistant professor at the University of Arizona in the spring?
In the fall, next year. Yeah.
And today we'll be talking about the glacial Indian Ocean.
All right. Okay, thank you all for coming out. Thanks for the invitation. It's my first time in Rutgers. It's been a fantastic day today. Lots of science. As Vince mentioned, I started in my academic career as a chemical engineer in southern India. Moved over to Texas, where for my PhD I focused on the Gulf of Mexico and sort of North Atlantic climate. And now for my postdoc, I'm moving back to my roots in the Indian Ocean and working on some exciting results, I think, in the Indian Ocean. So I'll show you some results from there. Okay, so to start off with, these are just some pictures from 2016 April, where the tropics experienced one of their most devastating heat extremes. And so this is a picture from Myanmar. You can see here they were very stressed. Thailand, Cambodia, extremely heat stressed over here. And this happened in a place in the tropics where you generally have, you think of extremes in terms of rainfall, but this was actually a temperature extreme. And so you can see here they were actually, they had to hose off animals to prevent them from dying. It ultimately ended up resulting in around 300 deaths or so. And some of these countries are fragile societies in terms of their GDP, and so some of them are still facing the brunt of this extreme event that occurred in 2016. And so we decided to investigate this. And so you can look at the air temperature anomaly during 2016. And you had upwards of 6 degrees in terms of a monthly temperature anomaly, which is quite large when you think about it. And so when we take a look at the seasonal cycle at this particular location, so that's inside this box right here, you can actually see that Aprils are the warmest months of the year in general. So after April, you have the monsoon set in, and then things start to cool down. But Aprils are naturally prone to extremes in this location because they're the warmest month of the climatological seasonal cycle. But this one was an especially extreme one. Just to show you right here, here's a time series of April starting from about 1945, since when they started recording temperatures after the war. And you can see that this one is way up there. So this sort of goes to the question of, is this a new normal? Are these things going to become more common? And so we wanted to investigate this, but we also know that the 2016 event happened right after a very large-sized El Nino event. And you might have heard of El Niños and La Niñas. I'll talk about that in a bit. But this is an index called Niño 3.4, which is a box in the Pacific Ocean where we measure sea surface temperatures, and you can see the red years are El Nino years and the blue are La Nina years. And essentially, virtually every single extreme that happened, warm extreme that happened in this box in Southeast Asia, corresponds with an El Nino event. Although you should keep in mind that not all El Nino events result in heat extremes. But the point we want to drive here is that although we know that global warming is taking place and it affects different regions and differently in different places, we know that interannual variability drives these extremes. Okay? And so just to take a step back here, I know most of you are familiar with El Nino and La Nina, but for those of you who aren't, essentially the El Nino phenomenon is a coupled ocean atmosphere process that happens on an interannual timescale. So you can see here, proceeding to that April 2016 warm event, this happened during December 2015. Again, I have plotted the departure from average temperatures right here from 1981 to 2010. So basically you can see in the central equatorial Pacific and the eastern equatorial Pacific, you see anomalous warming. And this warming is so large that it actually disrupts the subsurface of the ocean as well. So there's a change in where the thermocline, or where there's a sharp change in the temperatures with depth, all of these features of the Pacific Ocean get affected during El Nino events. And like I showed you, what happens in the tropical Pacific doesn't stay in the tropical Pacific, and these El Nino events, these coupled ocean atmospheric process, they drive anomalous hydroclimatic variations all across the planet. And we're motivated to study these things because even though in our paper we showed that the mechanism through which the Southeast Asian region was affected was through the Indian Ocean, essentially it's the Pacific Ocean that's in the driver's seat that's pushing these extremes to become extreme during these El Nino and La Nina events. Okay? And the major motivation for this, of course, is this graphic right here, which I really like. It's kind of emblematic. It shows, so more people live inside that circle than outside of it. So these are very densely populated areas, and they're, in many of these countries, the GDP is directly tied to climatic processes, how much it rains, and largely agrarian-based societies really do depend on how extreme the climate is going to be. So this is kind of the major motivation for us to study what's going on in the tropical Pacific and the tropics in general. So all these densely populated areas are a major motivation for us to try and understand where we're headed into in the future. Okay, so just taking another step back here, we know that the tropical oceans are dynamic and they're variable. So what I've plotted up over here is the standard deviation of sea surface temperatures. So I've removed the seasonal cycle, and this just shows you how much variability there is from year to year, okay? And so what I'd like to point out is that there's large fluctuations in the equatorial oceans right here. So you can see here, and this is the classic El Nino and La Nina pattern that imprints itself. And then when you take a look at the time series of variability, if you average all the tropical temperatures, you can see that there's fluctuations from year to year, but also that there's a long-term trend going forward. And this is kind of like what we have to work with in terms of observations is 100 years of data, but you know, the Earth has been around for a lot longer than that, and unfortunately, at present, we have no observations of the future, right? So we need to try and figure out how and what are the possible modes of variability that the climate system is capable of outside the present in itself, because the observations are short. One way we can do that is by running global climate models, and we try and understand if we can think about what is the forcing factors that are going to change climate into the future. We can run those into these supercomputers and try to see that are based on physics, and try to understand where we're headed into in the future. So again, we have the observations here that have variability, but they're also trending, and then we want to know where we're going to end up. But each climate model is going to give us slightly different answers, in both in terms of its mean state, how hot it is, and in terms of the variability. And so, like I showed you, small fluctuations can mean big impacts. And so we really want to narrow down which one of these models, or which one of these models best represents the future, or how to better understand and better prepare for the future. And so I'm a paleoclimatologist and a paleoceanographer. And so the past is really the key to the future in the sense of trying to extend and understand what physics are possible from the climate system. And so I use inorganic geochemistry, mainly things like corals, shells, and stalagmites to try and extend this observational record. But sometimes, considering some of the large-term variability that some of the models are showing us, and considering that we're headed into a bizarre future that we really haven't seen for a long time, you have to go way further back in time sometimes. And for that, I mainly use sediment cores. For the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing specifically on the last glacial maximum and try to make a case that we can actually infer things from the last glacial maximum to be somewhat relevant to the future, even though we're headed into a warming world and not a cooling world. I think as a community, we're coming to realize that there is no perfect analog for the future. that people used to look at Pliocene or Miocene, and we've had to go further back and back where CO2 levels were a lot higher. And even then, it was a different world. So I like the idea that the climate system, the past climate should be looked at as machinery of the same mechanism, as opposed to something that's an analog for the future. So I'll try and show you in this talk that we can use time periods and look at dynamic analogs as opposed to analogs of the future in general. And so I basically work with Foraminifera right here. For this talk, I'll explain what those are and how we're going to use them. But ultimately, my research takes observations, looks at the models, then we try to extend those with proxies, and ultimately try and make the proxies talk to the models. Okay? And so first, I'm going to start off with the models right now. And coming back to the tropical oceans, we want to take a look at what future variability looks like. And so here is a plot of 39 different CMIP-5, or Climate Model Intercomparison Project, CMIP-5 models. 39 different models. If I take their year-to-year variability and what they're projecting for 2100, and then I average amongst all those models, this is the plot that I get. So the first order thing that you can take home from here is that most of the screen is white. What that means is that the models don't agree with themselves. One shows increase, one shows decrease, and they cancel out. The second interesting thing that comes out of this is that the model seems, some of the models, or at least the average of all the models, seem to show that there's a large increase or something anomalous is going on in the Indian Ocean right there. So if I take the plot that I showed you before of the standard deviation of temperatures across the tropical oceans, and now I've skewed it such that the Indian Ocean is in the center right here. We can see the El Niño, La Niña in the Pacific. We can see the Atlantic Niño, some of you might know. The Indian Ocean seems to be anomalous here because there's weak SST variability as compared to the Pacific or the Atlantic. And the major reason for this is that the winds and the zonal gradients are different in the Indian Ocean. What I mean by that, in the Pacific and in the Atlantic, you can see at the equator, there's a big gradient. So a lot cooler temperatures here, a lot warmer temperatures here. There's a large gradient zonally going from the east to the west. Same is the case for the Atlantic as well. And because of these zonal gradients, they drive strong trade winds. And so you have easterlies that blow from the east to the west, the trade winds, in the Pacific and the Atlantic. In the mean annual picture, this is not the case in the Indian Ocean, and it's actually the opposite, where because you have a weak gradient from actually going from west to east, the eastern Indian Ocean is actually a little warmer than the west, you actually have weak westerlies that's opposite to the other basins. Okay, and because of this, why we're going into this is that because of this, you actually have a really small magnitude SST variability. So just to zoom in a little more closer to the Indian Ocean, this is again that same picture. So in the mean annual, we have a small zonal SST gradient, and you have very weak westerlies that blow in the mean annual picture. And what happens as a result of this is that there's weak interactions between the ocean and the atmosphere. The thermocline, where the temperature sharply changes in the subsurface, is uniformly deep throughout the equatorial Indian Ocean. And as a result of that, whatever is going on in the atmosphere doesn't really get picked up by the ocean. So there's not a lot of talking between the ocean and the atmosphere in the equatorial Indian Ocean, unlike in the other two basins. And in the Pacific especially, we know that that leads to the El Niño phenomenon and has huge impacts. And that drives what's going on in the Indian Ocean. But in the modern, there's not much going on in the Indian Ocean, despite, because of these reasons. Now, the same plot, if we take a look at what the models are saying for the future, this is the mean state predicted by models for the future. So they're suggesting a radically different Indian oceanography for the future. And what they say is that the eastern Indian Ocean is going to warm less, so yellow colors are less warming, darker colors, red colors are more warming. The eastern Indian Ocean is going to warm less than the western Indian Ocean. And as a result of this imbalance, this triggers these easterlies. Okay, so now the models are suggesting a picture where the Indian Ocean becomes a little bit more similar to the other basins, that you have easterlies and you have this sort of zonal gradient from east to the west. And this altered mean state also should mean that there's stronger coupling between the ocean and the atmosphere. So if you have these anomalous easterly winds that are blowing there, that actually triggers a response in the thermocline, and you have more talking between, or at least you have the capability of more talking between the atmosphere and the ocean. And like we saw when we look at the variability, so that is the departures, the year-to-year changes, the amount of change from 1 year to 1 year, the variability seems to increase right here. Okay, so that has a large impact on variability according to what the models say. So since the gradients change, we want to know. So the real fundamental question that we're asking here is that, is there any type of mechanistic analog to this that we see? This is something we can't see in the observations because the observations don't show us this. In 100 years of observations, we don't have a mean state that's altering, that has been permanently altered to show something like this. So we want to know, are there any past periods when the Indian Ocean has seen such fundamental changes? And essentially, like I said before, we need paleoclimate records to really validate whether the climate system, what type of machinery the climate system has. Right, so this is the main message that we're trying to get here. And we have identified the last glacial maximum as a potential mechanistic analog. So allow me to explain here. If we focus on the tropics, these are all, I should say, these are all these circles are SST reconstructions of the last glacial maximum. And the color tells you how much cooling there is. So green means it's less cooling compared to the modern at that point. Dark blue means there's more cooling. Okay, so when we take a look at the equatorial Indian Ocean, even though it's a messy pattern on the whole, in the equatorial Indian Ocean, we observe that the western Indian Ocean seems to have cooled less than the east. Okay, so the east-west contrast is similar to future projections. So this is a little difficult to wrap around, at least for me. So I simplified this. So if we take this as the modern gradient in the Indian Ocean, this is the west, this is the east. The LGM case says that the east cooled more than the west. Okay, and the global warming case seems to be that the east will warm less than the west. Okay, so there seems to be some type of similarity between these two cases, albeit in a radically different state, in a mean state. But we want to take advantage of this. How can we take advantage of the fact that the zonal contrast in the Indian Ocean during the LGM and in the global warming case is similar? And so the way we do that is first we want to take a look at the mean state of the last glacial maximum. So mind you, by no means are we proposing that the future is going to bring a last glacial maximum. That's not what we're trying to say here. We know that the LGM is a time period where sea level was radically different. You had ice sheets all over the northern hemisphere. Greenhouse gases were 100 ppm lower than pre-industrial times. And you had a slightly different orbital configuration. And you also had large changes in the land-sea configurations. Particularly, you had the exposure of the Sunda Shelf and the Sahul shelves right here. And so we know that there's dramatically different boundary conditions that happened in this time period 21,000 years ago. But what we can do is take those same models that are projecting the future, and we can feed them these boundary conditions and try to learn something from those models and what they tell us about the mechanisms and the dynamics that are going on in the Indian Ocean, right? So for the purposes of this talk, I'll be focusing on a model, CESM, or the Community Earth System model. It's the model run in NCAR in Boulder. And so we can feed all of these things into the model and try to see what it can say about the mean state or variability or different types of questions. That's why it's nice having a model, because you can query anything you want from it. What were the winds doing? What was the thermocline doing? Even though we may not have proxies for those things, right? And so when we take a look at the model, this is what the model simulates for the LGM Indian Ocean. So I, again, have all those proxies. And this is what the model tells me that's in the colors below the proxies. So interestingly, there are some similarities. Of course, it's not a perfect match. It never will be. But we want to look. But on the 0th order, we do see that the model also says that there's more cooling in the eastern equatorial Indian Ocean than the west. So it cools. The model says the west cools about -2 degrees-ish, although the proxies are saying it was actually even less warming. And then over here, the model is saying it's about 3 to 4 degrees, consistent with some proxies. But what the model says is that with this stronger zonal SST gradient, you have the onset of these easterlies. So you have anomalous easterlies that are onset during the last glacial maximum. And the model also tells us that you have really strong ocean-atmosphere dynamics. So there's a lot of coupling between, a lot of air-sea coupling. And ultimately, the prediction is that you have a Pacific-like mean state, because the east-west contrast is very similar to the modern Pacific Ocean. And the prediction is that this leads to Pacific-like variability. So when we take a look at what's going on in terms of year-to-year changes, this is what the model says. So you have this large increase in variability, year-to-year changes, is the standard deviation, change from the present to the LGM. And so you have a large increase, upwards of 100% in certain areas in the eastern equatorial Indian Ocean during the LGM. And of course, this looks kind of familiar to us, because this is what the global warming case also tells us, right? And when we actually separate this out into its different modes of variability, we can see, so I'm dividing that up into seasonality versus interannual variability, so purely year-to-year changes, and this is the change in the seasonal cycle, so how different the summers are with respect to the winters, whereas here it's how different one summer is with the next summer, interannual variability, right? And so when we split these out, both of these also seem to show large increases. They look kind of similar, but there are some distinct differences between them too. So for example, the interannual variability is confined to the equator right here, whereas the seasonal cycle change is a little more off-equatorial in its nature. And I won't go into the details right now, but I can assure you that this interannual mode of variability has dynamics very, very similar to the modern El Niño in the Pacific Ocean, okay? I'll come back to that in a little bit. But ultimately, we want to know how can we reconstruct something like this? How do we reconstruct variability, not mean state? All of those proxies gave us a mean estimate of how cold the LGM was, last glacial maximum, but we want to know how can we reconstruct variability at the LGM? And so the answer to that for this talk, like I mentioned, is through Planktic Foraminifera. And many of you are familiar here, but basically Planktic Foraminifera are microzooplankton that live at the surface of the water column in the oceans. And they build calcium carbonate tests that fall down to the ground. We can go collect them and analyze all sorts of chemicals in them to try and understand what they can tell us about the water in which they grew in. Okay, so again, I don't need to give a refresher here, but just to say time usually goes downwards in a marine sediment core. That's a good sign if it does. And we tend to sample these one by one and go down time. That's kind of what my typical day looks like. Many of you are familiar with that. And the particular type of bug, as we call them, that I'm looking at in this talk is called G. ruber. Globigerinoides ruber. To make things a little more interesting, I made a nice baseball card for it. So the stats for this particular bug, that's what it looks like when it's alive. This is when it's dead. It's about 250 to 350 micron range for that picture. We know that they live for about a month, give or take 2 to 4 weeks. They are abundant throughout the year, at least at our site, and they live in the upper 30 meters or so, at least in today's modern conditions. That's something we can measure. You might ask, how do we know all these things? Well, we have sediment traps close to our sites. We have plankton tows. We've done a lot of sort of ground truthing and calibration work to really understand what we think its ecology is doing. And the ecology is always important because that's going to be very informative about how it's filtering the environmental signal that we're trying to look at. Okay? And so what we can then do is we can take multiple 4M shells from here, crush them up, any numbers depending on the abundance. We can take a look at measuring oxygen isotopes, which or the stable oxygen isotopic composition of the calcium carbonate. test, and that varies as a function of both the temperature in which the foram calcified, as well as the delta 18 of the seawater in which it calcified. And we can also measure things like magnesium calcium, which can vary as a function of temperature. To a smaller degree, it could be a function of salinity as well. But this is how it's done in terms of classic mean state foram geochemistry. Sorry about that. And here's just a plot to show you from a sediment trap. This is temperature right here. So that's a gridded product in orange. The dashed line is in situ buoy temperatures. And the red tells you the oxygen isotopic composition, just crudely converted directly into temperature. And we can see that it tracks the seasonal cycle pretty nicely. And then once you go down core, you can get some type of wiggle and try and understand how climate changed in the past. But again, this is mean state foram geochemistry. This doesn't really tell you anything about the variability. So in order to reconstruct the variability, we have to turn towards a different type of measurement called individual foram analysis. I'm going to be calling that IFA. So if you see that, that's what that means. And in IFA, instead of crushing up all of these and getting one measurement, we actually measure each individual shell. So to give you how that looks like, if we measure a bunch of these shells, we'll get some type of population distribution. And we can then interpret them as the variability within this time slice. So I'll just walk you through how that looks like. And ultimately, interpreting IFA requires rigor. I'll tell you why. Because there are questions that arises. For example, how many bugs do you need to get a robust measurement? That's something that's really important. We need to understand how to appropriately compare these data sets with one versus the other. We need to interpret whether they're representing seasonal cycle changes or longer forms of variability. And ultimately, we want to have a good way to compare them to model output, because that's what we want. We want to try and ground truth a model's prediction. So to quickly walk you through all of this, one of the ways that we've addressed this is through forward modeling. And so you can take actual measured temperature and salinity and translate it into delta 18O space. We can then say that is the actual histogram of this entire time series. Then we can choose 15 random months that we pick and say, okay, that's what that histogram looks like. Then we can keep doing it over and over again until we get a good approximation of that white histogram, or we may never get a good approximation depending on how many forams you pick. So if you increase the number of forams, you can get a slightly better estimate. We can model this, which we've done. So if you go from 0 forams up to 200 forams on the x-axis, the dashed line is the accurate measurement. So we know the answers because we're doing forward modeling. And the green and the red are the standard deviations. And so the further they are from this dashed line, the more is the error. And so that's the deviation from the true statistic. So we can model this, and we know, and of course this changes in location by location by location, and depending on the foram habitat, but we can address this. And then now we want to compare, after we address, we say, okay, you need n number of bugs to actually get a good measurement at a particular location. We want to be able to compare two different data sets. So the way we do that is we can take our modern sample here, we can take the last glacial maximum core top, or last glacial maximum sediment sample here, and let's say we measure a bunch, and let's say we get the exact same histogram for both of those. So the variability should be the same. Well, we can compare the histograms, A, by looking at box plots. So a box plot tells you the median and the interquartile range. So we can actually just look at the box plots and tell us, which can tell us about the variability. And mind you, I've removed the mean here. So obviously the LGM is a cooler time period, but I subtracted the mean here, so I've put them both on the same scale. So they're both normalized, okay? And then we can use this thing called a QQ plot, or a quantile-quantile plot. Sounds intimidating, it's not. And a quantile-quantile plot is nothing but taking these histograms and converting them into percentiles and plotting the percentiles against each other. So for example, if I were to look at quartiles, which would be at 25%, 50%, 75%, 100%, I'd have 4 points to plot against each other. And then if they were exactly identical, they would plot on a 1:1 line. So I choose the number of quantiles based on the measurement of forams. So each quantile represents at least 5 measurements for me, so I can then interpret them robustly. So if they were exactly the same, they would all fall on this 1:1 line. Now if you see a decrease in variability, maybe that looks something like that, the box plot would show smaller, and then you see a decreased slope right here. Okay, so the LGM with respect to the pre-industrial. And then if I measured increased variability, that's what that quantile plot would show me, okay? So now we have a way to actually compare the statistics of these different distributions. And of course, the climate signal at a location is the key in telling us whether it's seasonal or not. So we can actually take the observations, we can split them up, and we can statistically say, I'm going to increase the seasonality here, the average winter to summer, I'm going to decrease it. And then you can do the same type of experiment where we pick the number of months, and then we can measure the sensitivity of the actual, so the red is the actual, and then the green and the pink will tell us how sensitive our technique is at this location to different changes in seasonality or decadal scale variability and so forth. And finally, when we come to the model data comparison, we can take the model output and do the exact same thing. So we can say, okay, we're going to pick from the model what the foram is telling us, or we think it's telling us, and then we put the, then we can test different scenarios with the climate model. So if this is our actual data, that's what the data says, then we can take the climate model and say, I'm going to have a seasonal only configuration where I just change the seasonality at one time period versus the other. And then I'm going to have interannual or year-to-year changes only. And then whichever better matches up, then the model is informing us, the climate model is telling us that at least this is a better explanation for your data. Whether that's correct or not is a different question, but we can at least test for consistency between the data sets and the model. Okay, so with that process, I'm going to walk you through some results. To get back to the question at hand, we know that the simulated variability at the LGM is large. So our question is, can the individual foram data confirm whether this Indian Ocean is capable of larger variability or not? That's what we want to try and answer. So we chose 4 different cores right here. And all of these 4 cores have papers written about them. They have detailed age models. They have mean state reconstruction, so we know exactly what the forams are doing. So we chose these cores specifically because they're well dated as well. And we wanted to test them also based on their location. So 2 of these cores are more equatorial. And if you remember the sea surface temperature seasonality versus interannual plot, they're located more sensitive to the interannual changes. This one is also in the large increased area, and it's more sensitive to changes in seasonal cycle. We also chose a core right here, which is our core of null hypothesis. So according to the model, there is no change here in variability. And so we wanted to take a core to test whether it will show us a test of null hypothesis or not. Okay, so I'm going to walk you through the results starting from the southernmost core right here. I'm going to plot the box plots here. Again, the delta AT0 is negatively correlated with temperature, so warm is up, cool is down. I'm going to show you the core top and the last glacial maximum right there. And also, I'm going to plot the QQ plot, the quantile plot, and here's the 1:1 line. I should note that it's not at a 45-degree angle because the scales are different right here. So that's the 1:1 line right there. Okay, so the first core, this is what we see in the data set. So each one of these dots is a foram measurement. And this is the box plot for the Holocene and for the LGM right here. So at the first sight, we see that maybe there's a slight increase in variability, but it's not statistically significant. Our p-value is much, much larger than 0.05. We do not see significantly different variability at this site. And when we plot that on a QQ plot, you can see that the dashed red line is the regression line for these points. It is statistically not different from the 1:1 line. Okay, so the first data point outside doesn't seem to show any changes or much changes. But when we go up to the northern core just north of that, now we start to see really large changes. Okay, so these are really big changes on the order of 0.5 per mil in the warm direction, 0.5 per mil in the cooler direction. And then the QQ plot also shows us that there's an increased slope at this particular site right here. When we move to the more equatorial sites, we see the largest changes. Really large changes at the LGM compared to the modern. These are on the same exact species, same size fraction. We're just seeing incredibly large changes in the delta 18O. Again, mind you, I've subtracted the mean from the LGM and the modern, so I'm just comparing the variability. And the QQ plots also tell us that there's incredibly large changes. If you were to convert it into purely temperature space, then we're seeing on the order of about 0.6 per mil, which means it's somewhere close to 3 degrees C in one direction. So these are large changes. Go back to the plot where the Indian Ocean, I looked at the standard deviation of SSTs, and there was not much variance there at all. But now we're seeing very, very large changes. And finally, at our northernmost site, we again confirm that there's large changes here. Okay, so when we put all this together, in the circles here is our data. So I have latitude going down from north to south, and this is standard deviation, the increased in variability. So in circles, I have the data, and in squares, I have the model output. So this is incredibly interesting, where you have the magnitude as well as the spatial nature agreeing with the model. Many of you work with model data comparisons. This does not happen too often. And so the real question is now, how can we take advantage of this fact that we are seeing very similar reconstructions from the data, as well as the model seems to explain this very nicely. So we really wanted to look at the mechanisms through which this is happening. But before we do that, we really wanted to scrutinize whether these data are telling us anything about changes in seasonality or changes in year-to-year variability. And so what type of variability it's indicating is really important, because only then can we infer the mechanisms of what the model is telling us. So as I said, the core locations have different sensitivities. So these 3 cores are in the region where you see increased variability. This one seems to be in a place where you have seasonal cycle changes, whereas these 2 are more sensitive to interannual changes. So I'm just going to focus on this one site for now, but I'll tell you how we tried to separate between the year-to-year changes and the seasonal cycle changes. So again, it's that same plot right there. This is the QQ plot, each one warmer up, and that's the 1:1 line. Now we took the model and we said, we're not going to change the interannual variability in the model. We're going to take whatever it's simulating in the pre-industrial, we're going to fix that to the LGM, but allow the seasonal cycle to change as it would normally, as it simulates. So the seasonal cycle is allowed to change, but the interannual variability doesn't. And when we plot that, these are the different configurations that the model can take on this QQ plot. It explains a large portion of it. So a large part of the QQ plot does fall under this envelope where only seasonal changes can explain a large part of it. But when we take the full LGM output, the seasonal as well as the interannual changes, we see that there's a slightly better fit, and it is statistically significant. So there are some points here that I'd like to point out that the full simulation gives us a better fit. But what I'd also like to point out is that the data seem a lot more variable than even the model. So the data is telling us that there was more changes, more extreme changes than what the model is actually simulating. But ultimately, this exercise helped us sort of narrow down and tell us that the models and the data, when you put them together, it's really tough to explain the data without invoking changes in both seasonal cycle as well as year-to-year changes. And so with this, we basically infer that we want to understand the mechanisms of what's going on from what the model actually tells us. And so when we get into the mechanisms, we take a step back and we want to understand the dynamics of SST variability. So there's a lot going on in this plot, but this is a picture of what CESM simulates during the LGM. And ultimately, because you have the exposure of these shelves right here, you actually decrease during a key season in spring, you decrease the amount of rainfall, because all of a sudden what used to be ocean, what is ocean now used to be land. And so you actually decrease the amount of rainfall because of changes in albedo during that particular season. And that actually triggers this divergence right here. So you basically have divergence here that doesn't allow, that suppresses rainfall. And when that divergence occurs, that's what triggers these anomalous easterlies. So just to walk you through that again, because of the exposure of these shelves during the last glacial maximum, you decrease rainfall, and you decrease rainfall, you suppress it by having this anomalous subsidence. And that triggers these anomalous easterlies, much in the same way that we saw earlier on in the LGM case. And these easterlies, basically, they push up the water over here and trigger upwelling. So the anomalous easterlies form this zonal SST gradient. And ultimately, because of these easterlies, the thermocline shoals here. So you have strong ocean-atmosphere coupling in a place that today you have a uniformly deep thermocline. But during the past, because of this change in rainfall, because of the triggering of these anomalous easterlies, you actually have strong ocean-atmosphere coupling. Now the thermocline shoals in the eastern equatorial Indian Ocean. So all of a sudden, you're in a world where anomalies that happen in the atmosphere, random wind fluctuations, can now be felt by the ocean. The ocean can now see these things, and it integrates these things, and it can develop over the seasonal cycle and impose these anomalies on year-to-year changes as well. So the ability to sustain these anomalies basically is what happens during the LGM, according to CESM. And ultimately, once you start the conversation between the atmosphere and the ocean, this is when you can have large year-to-year variability, very similar to the El Niño phenomenon in the Pacific. And so this variability that we see here, we're proposing that the Indian Ocean has its own El Niño, own little El Niño, during the glacial Indian Ocean. And just to show you that, this is a Hofmolar plot. On the right, I have the modern Pacific Ocean based on observations, so based on measurements, going from the western equatorial Pacific to the eastern equatorial Pacific. And this is April of year 0, going up to 2 years out. Okay? And you can basically, and this is a composite of all the El Niños in the observed record. So when you average all of the El Niños, this is the picture that it looks. The contours that I have here are the contours of the changes in the thermocline depth, and the arrows basically tell you the way that the winds blow. So essentially, during an El Niño event, this is just a fancy plot to show what I had shown you earlier, that during an El Niño event, the central and eastern equatorial Pacific warms. You have a change in the way that the winds blow, going from west to east instead of east to west. It's a reversal. And you actually have a shoaling of the thermocline over here. And you have, you have a shoaling of the thermocline in the western equatorial Pacific. And on the left over here, this panel right here is from the model, is from CESM, but it's for the glacial Indian Ocean. So if I take all of the El Niño events that the model is simulating and I average it up, this is what it's showing us right here. That you have a warming during these El Niño events in the central and eastern equatorial Indian Ocean, and you have coeval cooling. Now, the one thing to keep in mind here is that the season during which this develops and peaks, this peaks during SON, or September, October, November, whereas the El Niño phenomenon peaks during December, January, February. So there's a slightly different phase in the Indian Ocean El Niño, but we see dynamics that are very, very similar. And coming back, finally, trying to link it back to the future now, this is the increase in variability according to CESM during the last glacial maximum, and this is the global warming projection. And there is similarity between them, and both the data as well as the models indicate that there is large variability that's capable in the Indian Ocean. And lastly, going back to this, this is the same event, April 2016. This entire event was driven by El Niño, with the Pacific Ocean in the driver's seat and the Indian Ocean playing a passive role but a mechanistically important role. In the future, if there was to be an onset of what we're proposing is the Indian Ocean El Niño, these could be even more exacerbated. And so ultimately, I'm going to end my talk here with a couple of take-home messages. I hope I've shown you that single forams can quantify past climate variability, whether it's seasonality or interannual variability. You got to be careful while you're interpreting it, but there are ways to do so. There's a blueprint to actually interpret the statistics of IFA. We see unanimously that there's intensified climate variability during the LGM, according to all our data sets, and that there are strong parallels between the last glacial maximum and future projections. We are looking into this more into detail right now and trying to look at the more into the mechanistic similarities and during which season the onset's going to be and how that might actually interact with the overall sustenance of these anomalies. But ultimately, the major take-home point is that the Indian Ocean can and potentially has harbored larger climate variability in the past. So this leads us to the question of whether the Indian Ocean in the modern state is actually unusual. A couple of ways that we're taking this work forward. I was on a ODP expedition a couple years ago where we have sites that cover the LGM, and we want to try and look at it more in a spatial dimension, because if there was an Indian Ocean El Nino going on, it would have definitely would have had impacts elsewhere across the basin, obviously. Even though it was a smaller phenomenon than the Pacific El Nino, it still would have had large impacts. And so we're looking at different time intervals in the past, whether we can see this or not. And looking at Holocene-based individual foram as well, because some of the models are telling us that this type of phenomenon occurred during the mid-Holocene simulations as well. At least they're pointing towards that. Also, I recently got funded to work on some stalagmites that cover glacial time periods, and we're going to try and explore whether this Indian Ocean El Nino had any type of teleconnection impact on rainfall, and especially specifically monsoon rainfall over India. And finally, I will end right there. Thank you very much. I'm happy to hear all opinions and criticisms about this. And you can tweet at me at Holy Cow if you're so inclined. And thanks to all my collaborators. And lastly, like Vince mentioned, I'll be joining University of Arizona. So if any of you are potentially interested in a master's, PhD, or postdoc, or if you know someone that might be looking, please feel free to email me. I'm happy to hear any ideas that you might have. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much. Yes.
So statistically, how many forms are enough to get the full range of the seasonal variations? And the opposite was that magic number for the multi-specimen analysis to get the signal, to avoid the seasonality.
To avoid the seasonality.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, how many forams does it take? So like I said, there's a couple of ways that you can address this. None are perfect because you don't know the past, but you assume some things about the past. But essentially what we can do is we can take the modern record of observations, any past 50 years or whatever you want it to be, take the past 50 years of temperature and salinity, convert them into delta AT-No. That's something we can do. And we can say that, okay, if a foram lived, I'm sorry, where do I have this? Yeah, right there. So this is the delta AT-No over that we actually calculate. And then we can say, okay, if I take 15 forams, this is the type of variability, this is the type of histogram I get. And you can keep doing this process in a Monte Carlo process multiple times. And once you start doing that, then you can see, okay, when do I actually approximate the statistics of the answer? And so this plot is what that describes. This is for the standard deviation and for the range, where this is the departure from the actual statistics. So 0 is perfect reconstruction of the statistics. And as you increase, obviously you keep going, you get better and better, but you have a large error window to consider. And if you'll notice, even at like 200 forams, you're not 100% accurate. And the reason for that is that when you're looking at statistics of extremes, which we are, analytical uncertainty pushes the extremes in more extremes regardless of how you look at it. So the negative one is going to be pushed to the more negative side, and the positive one is going to be pushed to the more positive side, and that actually doesn't add up back to 0. But ultimately, you can do the same exercise to try and see how much you get. Now, I understand your question is more in terms of seasonal versus interannual. The first question is, can it get the climate there at all? The second question is, then we can take that particular climate time series at that location, and we can say, instead we can say, okay, I'm going to artificially change only seasonality, or hold seasonality constant, only change interannual variability by 100% or so, and then try to see what is the sensitivity of this technique at that particular location. This is the best that we can do, at least right now, in terms of trying to curb down how many forams we might need to actually get it.
What did you get for this particular location?
It's actually right. So in the tropics, because there's hardly much seasonal cycle variability, it's about 2 degrees at our location, and the interannual anomalies are on the order of about 0.5 degrees because the Indian Ocean doesn't have that much interannual variability. We say that you can get a robust signal at like 20 forams, for example. But we know that structurally there's going to be a lot more difficulties in that we don't want 20 forams. So if you want to know my numbers, I think we analyzed somewhere close to 80 forams for the Holocene and 80 forams for the last glacial maximum. But we did that by combining more and more samples. So that's 80 forams coming from, say, 500 to 1,000 years. But in our case, it's okay because the signal that we're seeing is a large signal, and we're not worried about bioturbation or things like that because we're so far apart in time in a completely different world that the signal to noise actually wins out on that. That's the claim that we're making. At least, I mean, the fact is we see a large increase in variability with the same number of forams. So we want to try and understand that, yeah. Yes? Yeah, that's a great point. So the question is that this assumes no seasonality in the forams. That's not true though. We actually have modern sediment traps at this location that tell us the flux of forams, this particular type of forams. We actually know exactly when they peak, when they don't peak. And this particular species at this location is actually abundant throughout the year. So we do know it. Unfortunately, we can't put sediment traps in the last glacial maximum, so we don't know how it was back then. But what we do have is we do have the carbon isotopic measurements of the forams during that time. And so when we take a look at the carbon isotope values for the different sites, we see the exact same range of variability. And even though they're slightly offset means, the variability of each one of these critters in terms of carbon isotopes showed us the exact same thing. So that to me says that we're in a good place to understand that the habitats or water masses or upwelling or different things that might affect the ecosystem of the rubers are not dramatically changing from year to year. So that's another way we can target this. Yes?
I want to follow up on that.
Sure.
So you said they grow all year round, but do they not have a seasonal peak?
They don't, there basically is a seasonality in their flux per se, but at the same time they dominate so much. I can show you a plot of how we have the flux variability, for example, but it's not consistent. There is no one season that they're tied to, for example. So it's not that it's not like Truncatulinoides that peaks in DJF year after year. It's more the case that, yeah, they increase and they decrease, but they occur throughout the year. One year's peak is in November and another year's peak is in February sometime. And so one of the other ways that we're taking this project forward is to actually take a look at particular bugs like Bouloides that only grows during SON. So if they don't grow during any of the other times of the year, then when we look at their IFA, they're telling us directly about interannual variability. They're not telling us about seasonality. And so that's, proposal is pending, basically. So, but that's the idea, is to take advantage of the seasonality of these different creatures.
So we're glacials 2, 6, 8, 10 equivalent, and 1, 5e, 7, and 9, and 11. How much variability predicted by the models would you?
So the question is, other glacials and other interglacials, what would the model predict? So unfortunately, the models are not run for all of those, but there are models that are run for the mid-Holocene, which you could claim is a somewhat loose analog for MIS 5e. We can argue about that, but and there are also model simulations run of 5e themselves, And there's also a simulation of 3, I think, in the PMIP as a whole. But we have model simulations from this particular model going from 80,000 years up till present in different slices. And we see that during pretty much every time period we simulate, apart from a couple, that there's large increases in variability compared to the modern. Now, how much they compare in and of themselves, that's still to be decided, and that probably has to do with complex interplay between orbital forcing and glacial forcing. So you might have to find a sweet spot when maybe like 40,000 years, 45,000 years to really think about how both of those things interact to amplify the seasonal gradient. So ultimately, the thumb rule is, because in the future there is no there's orbital change, but in the near future there's no sea level change. But yet we get this increase in variability. And the key to that is the gradient, the SST gradient. So if you look at cores from the west and cores from the east, and you look at the difference between them, whenever that gradient is largest, I will predict that that's when the variability should be largest as well. So that's what's driving it. And so whether all these glacials are interglacials, which one shows the strongest, that's going to be highly dependent on the interaction between glacial forcing and orbital forcing. So I don't know. It's a good question. I think that's yet to be determined. There's a lot to do over there. Yeah?
Yeah, well, the SST gradient is very important in terms of it, so I would argue that the total SST is also very important, at least for. And so now, very warm SSTs produce deep convection, which is how answer is achieved. So I was wondering, in your case, in the past, what were the total SSTs? And because you seem to have some, does it show the homogeneous diagram?
Yeah.
They show some convection from the west to the east, also in the last.
That plot?
Yeah, no, in the homogeneous diagrams.
I see.
So, well, I was wondering, what is the total SST in your simulations? Because in modern day NEMSO, you actually need
A particular threshold to actually convect.
With a warming climate, we're going to have more less because there's going to be more deep convection in the Western Pacific. So how that happens in your simulations?
I think that's still debatable whether there's going to be increased ENSO due to that, because you also have to consider the fact that you have to correct that warming trend prior to calculating ENSO, regardless of what deep convection does. But I take your point that one thing is we know for a fact that the Walker circulation didn't shut down during the LGM. So there was still convection going on. We know that for sure. But whether, and if we want, it's very easy to calculate the absolute SST. So for example, you could say that, let's say this shows, even though those two sites show slightly different temperatures, if you take a warming of, a cooling of 3 degrees from the modern, then we're talking about 25 degrees in the glacial. You're still tropical, you're still in the tropics, so you're still going to have convection. It's not suppressed, and we have evidence from multiple different, for example, lake level, we have evidence through stalagmites, multiple different archives that tell us that the Walker circulation wasn't shut down per se. So if you have Walker circulation, you know you're convecting. It's just the degree to which. And as a whole, as a thumb rule, you do know that the glacial as a whole had lesser rainfall. But in terms of how it was imposed in different spatial regions, that's different. So we're arguing here that it's still consistent regardless of the absolute SSTs not being the same way. I mean, not being at a particular threshold. Yeah.
Any more questions? Let's thank Hal.